Colonel Potter, sir, my last wish is to be buried in my mother's wedding gown.
I've seen these Dodgers for 40 years, all the tricks. Dismissed!
Picture this. A hit sitcom kills off one of its most beloved characters with a single line, no warning, no music, no laugh track. Just silence. That actually happened on primetime American television, and it changed the way audiences understood what a comedy show could do. The show was MASH, and behind that shocking moment was a real actor who had already decided he was done. That's just the first of several departures that shaped one of the most influential shows in TV history. And the reasons behind them range from ego and ambition, to burnout, to quiet creative disagreements that never made headlines at the time. Stick around, because some of these stories are still misunderstood today. Before we get into who left and why, it helps to understand what MASH actually was, because it wasn't just another army comedy. The whole thing started with a novel written by a former war surgeon under a pen name, drawing loosely on his own experiences patching up soldiers during the Korean War. That book made its way into a dark, satirical film in the early 1970s, one that leaned hard into anti-war sentiment at a moment when the country was still deeply divided over Vietnam. The film did well enough that a television network decided to gamble on turning it into a weekly series, and that gamble premiered in September of 1972. The early ratings were shaky. It wasn't an instant hit, and there was real talk of cancellation in that first season. But the network moved it to a better time slot. Audiences caught on, and within a couple of seasons it became appointment viewing. Part of what made it different from other sitcoms of the era was its willingness to sit with sadness. It used real battlefield sound design instead of a laugh track in many scenes. It let episodes end on a somber note instead of a punchline, and it treated its characters like people who were slowly being worn down by the absurdity around them, not just walking gag machines. It also helped that the show arrived at exactly the right cultural moment. Even though it was technically set during the Korean War, most viewers understood it as a stand-in for the ongoing conflict in Vietnam, and that double meaning gave even the silliest jokes an undercurrent of real unease. Audiences weren't just laughing at a bunch of doctors goofing off in a tent. They were watching a version of the war happening in their own living rooms, filtered through gallows humor, because straight tragedy would have been too much to sit through week after week. That balancing act, comedy heavy enough to keep people watching, honesty sharp enough to keep the show meaningful, is part of why it's still studied in film schools today. But maintaining that balance for 11 seasons meant the show couldn't stay static, and neither could the people playing these characters. As the writing grew more ambitious, some actors found themselves with meatier material than ever, while others found their characters stuck in place, still doing the same one joke season after season. That imbalance, more than any single scandal, is at the root of almost every major cast departure on this list. Over 11 seasons, the show would go through a fairly dramatic amount of cast turnover, and each departure tells a different story about ambition, mental health, creative fatigue, or simply an actor deciding that the role no longer fit who they wanted to become. Let's start with the one that shocked the country the most. If you ask people who grew up watching this show which single moment hit hardest, a lot of them will point to the same one. The ending of the Season 3 finale, when the audience learns, almost as an afterthought, that the commanding officer's plane has gone down over open water with no survivors. It's delivered in a matter of seconds, by a character who normally brought comic relief, and then the episode simply ends. No music swells. No comfort. That gut punch marked the exit of McLean Stevenson, who had played the pleasant, often bewildered commanding officer since the pilot episode. Stevenson's character worked so well because he was the opposite of the two rebellious young doctors at the center of the show. Where they pushed back against authority with sarcasm and pranks, his character represented a kind of exhausted decency, a man doing his best in a job he never really wanted, surrounded by younger officers who ran circles around him. Audiences loved him for it, and Stevenson picked up major award recognition in the early seasons for the role. But according to people who worked on the show at the time, Stevenson grew restless. As the series matured, the writing increasingly centered on the show's lead actor, who was also becoming more involved behind the camera as a writer and eventually a director. Stevenson reportedly felt his character was drifting into the background, valued mostly for comic relief rather than any real narrative weight. He had bigger ambitions than playing a supporting officer forever. He wanted to lead his own show and build a career as a genuine star, not just a beloved side character on someone else's hit. So at the close of season 3, he told producers he wouldn't be returning. Instead of quietly writing his character off with a transfer or retirement, the show's creators decided to use the moment to remind viewers what the series was really about underneath the comedy: a war where people don't always come home. That decision produced one of the most talked about scenes in television history, and it's still studied today as an example of a sitcom breaking its own rules to say something true. What happened to Stevenson afterward is the part of the story a lot of fans don't know. He signed on for a new show built entirely around his own charm, hoping to finally be the headline star rather than the second banana. It didn't take off, and a follow-up project a few years later fared even worse, becoming something of a punchline in industry retrospectives. Neither show managed to capture what audiences had responded to in him during his years on this series, and both were canceled well before they had a chance to build any real momentum. In later interviews, Stevenson reportedly expressed real regret about walking away when he did, acknowledging that leaving had cost him something rare, a role, and an ensemble that never quite came together the same way again for him professionally. It's a fairly common story in Hollywood, an actor underestimating just how much a show's success depends on a specific mix of writers, castmates, and timing, and overestimating how easily that magic can be replicated somewhere else. Stevenson wasn't a bad actor by any means, and his instincts about wanting more creative control weren't unreasonable, but the industry rarely rewards that kind of gamble, even when the reasoning behind it is sound. He continued working steadily in television for years afterward, picking up guest spots here and there, but he never again found a character that resonated with audiences the way his run as the frazzled, warm-hearted commanding officer had. When he passed away in the mid-1990s, former castmates spoke fondly of him, describing him as a genuinely kind person and a gifted comic actor. In a strange way, his early exit ended up cementing the legacy of his character rather than diminishing it. The scene that killed him off is still one of the most referenced moments in sitcom history, decades later, regularly cited in discussions of how television handles grief, shock, and the abrupt loss of a beloved character. If Stevenson's exit was loud and unforgettable, the departure of Wayne Rogers was almost the exact opposite: quiet, sudden, and handled with almost no fanfare at all. Rogers played the show's other young doctor, the wisecracking partner in crime to the show's lead, and together the two of them formed the comedic engine of the early seasons. Their chemistry was a big part of why the show worked in its first couple of years. Playful, quick, a little reckless, the kind of dynamic that made even grim material feel lighter. Behind the scenes, though, Rogers reportedly felt that the show wasn't turning out to be the true ensemble piece he thought he'd signed up for. As the series went on, the writing increasingly built around one central character, again largely because that actor was becoming deeply involved in shaping the show's direction and tone as a writer. Rogers felt his own character was losing dimension, reduced to reacting rather than driving scenes. He said in later interviews that his concern wasn't about vanity or wanting more screen time for its own sake. It was about watching a character with real potential get flattened into a sidekick role with less and less to actually do. Rather than negotiating publicly or making a dramatic exit, Rogers simply chose not to renew his involvement once his contract period ended, and reportedly did so with relatively little advance warning to the production. Adding a strange wrinkle to the whole situation, his original agreement with the show had apparently never been formally finalized as a signed contract, which meant there wasn't much legal leverage to compel him to stay or to punish him for leaving. He had, in effect, been working under a handshake arrangement the whole time. When it became clear he wasn't returning, the writers had to scramble to explain his character's absence at the start of the next season, and unlike Stevenson's dramatic send-off, there was no big farewell episode, no emotional goodbye scene. The character was simply gone, reassigned off-screen, and a new doctor took his place in the ensemble going forward. That replacement character, a more grounded, married family man, ended up reshaping the tone of the show in a way many longtime fans still argue about. Some feel the show lost a bit of its early rebellious energy once Rogers left. Others feel the series actually deepened emotionally once it moved away from pure buddy comedy toward more complex relationships. Either way, it's hard to deny the show found a new gear after his departure. As for Rogers himself, his story afterward took an unusual turn compared to most actors who leave a hit show. He didn't fully disappear from acting, picking up occasional television and film roles over the years, but his real second act was in finance. Having studied history in college before pursuing acting, he eventually built a genuinely successful career as an investor and later became a recognizable voice on financial news programs discussing markets and economic policy. He made significant money, not from residual checks, but from decades of savvy investing, something fairly rare for actors of his generation. Despite the abrupt and almost businesslike nature of his exit, there doesn't appear to have been any lasting animosity between him and his former co-star. The two reportedly stayed on good terms for years afterward. When Rogers passed away in 2015, tributes from former castmates described him as sharp, funny, and endlessly curious, someone who managed to build not one, but two entirely different successful careers in his lifetime. Not every departure from this show was about ambition or creative frustration. Some were about something much more personal. Gary Berghoff played the shy, endearing company clerk who could hear approaching helicopters before anyone else, a character who became something like the emotional center of the ensemble, innocent in a way that made the horror around him land even harder. He was also the only actor to carry his role over directly from the original film into the television series, and he shaped that character into something far gentler and more vulnerable than the film version had ever been. By the show's middle seasons, though, people close to production have described Berghoff as increasingly worn down, both personally and professionally. The demanding, near-constant production schedule of a weekly hour-long drama-comedy hybrid took a toll, and Berghoff has spoken in later interviews about struggling with anxiety and general burnout during his years on the show, at a time when mental health struggles among actors were rarely discussed publicly the way they are now. On top of the professional pressure, Berghoff was raising a young family, and the demands of the shooting schedule meant long stretches away from home. He said in interviews that missing significant chunks of his daughter's early childhood was something he came to deeply regret. There were also practical, contractual tensions. Berghoff reportedly pushed for adjustments to his workload, hoping for reduced appearances and more flexibility so he could manage both his mental health and his family life. Producers, well aware of how central his character had become to the emotional fabric of the show, tried to accommodate him to a degree, but it apparently wasn't enough to keep him long-term. By around the show's 8th season, he made the decision to leave for good. Unlike Wayne Rogers' quiet exit, Berghoff's departure was given real weight within the show itself, a multi-episode farewell arc that let his character return home for a family emergency and ultimately decide not to come back to the war. The final images of that storyline, his character walking away alone, leaving behind a personal keepsake, are still remembered as some of the most quietly devastating television of that era, precisely because there's so little dialogue and so much silence. After leaving, Berghoff largely stepped back from the spotlight. There was a short-lived spin-off attempt built around his character in a new setting, but it didn't find an audience and was quickly canceled. Rather than continuing to chase acting work, Berghoff shifted his focus toward painting, wildlife conservation efforts, and inventing, eventually holding patents related to fishing equipment. He's described his choice to leave show business largely behind as being about reclaiming a life that had started to feel unsustainable, prioritizing his family and his own well-being over continued fame.